and welcome to Certara's LinkedIn Live event, IRA Impacts, the first 10 drugs selected for the Drug Price Negotiation Program. Thank you for joining us. My name is Lee Stern, and I'm a Vice President of Client Engagement here at Certara. I have the esteemed pleasure to introduce our panelists. Dr. Shu is a board-certified physician in internal medicine and currently is the Medical Director for HMSA Blue Cross Blue Shield of Hawaii. In this position, he's responsible for utilization management and quality improvement. Prior positions have included being the Executive Director and Medical Director of Prudential Healthcare, as well as Associate VP and Medical Director for Patient Care at Worcester Medical Center, responsible for the Integrated Delivery Network. Dr. Shu is joined by my two colleagues at Certara, Dr. Max Vargas, VP of U.S. Access Strategy. Max has a PhD in biochemistry and an MBA in health policy. He leads a team of analysts focusing on projects involving late-stage launch, due diligence, and his experience cuts across all major therapeutic areas. Max and his team have designed successful pricing and contracting strategies for products at launch and throughout the life cycle. And finally, Caitlin Varelli, Director of U.S. Access Strategy, who holds an MBA from Columbia. Caitlin's specialties include data presentation and visualization, Medicaid and Medicare policy, reimbursement strategies, budget impact modeling, and financial forecasting. And prior to Certara, Caitlin worked at Ipsen and Sanofi, where she was a member of the pricing and contracting and market research groups. So welcome, everybody. And now on to the presentation.
Hi, everyone. I'm Caitlin Varelli. So on August of 2022, President Biden signed into law the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, or the IRA. So the IRA is what you might call Biden's signature legislation to date. It's an attempt by the administration to implement its key social, environmental, and tax policies. And of course, the IRA also includes a number of provisions which will significantly impact the pharma industry. So these can roughly be divided into two categories, which you see on the slide in front of you. Lower costs to patients and lower costs to CMS. So the initiatives on the left are the ones which will increase federal spending, and the ones on the right are projected to decrease the budget deficit while also reducing patient out-of-pocket costs. So we've highlighted the components that this webinar will focus on, namely the restructuring of Medicare Part D, as well as the negotiated prices. However, before we get to that, let's briefly review the other components. So on the top left, the payment boost for eligible biosimilars is intended to realign incentives to improve access to biosimilars and to overall reduce patient costs. So under Part B's standard ASP plus 6% reimbursement, providers might lack an incentive to utilize a biosimilar because as they're reimbursed on the price of the drug, they actually get a higher level of reimbursement for using a higher priced drug. However, since the Part B coinsurance is also paid based on drug price, this might mean that patients are paying unnecessarily high coinsurance. So this temporary payment boost, which is for 5 years, reimburses providers for biosimilars at 8% of the ASP of the originator drug. Therefore, it creates a financial incentive for providers to switch. And to qualify, biosimilars ASP must be less than that of the originator. So some of the impacted products include Remicade, Avastin, Herceptin, and Rituxan. Then on the top right is the delay of the safe harbor protection removal. So this refers to a Trump era rule that would have eliminated the anti-kickback safe harbor, which would have basically disallowed rebates in Medicare Part D, which was anticipated to raise Medicare spending and raise premiums for patients. So the IRA further delays the implementation of this rule till 2032. So let's move on to the next slide. So as you can see here, the IRA is being implemented over a number of years. The biosimilar boost went into place in 2022 as the safe harbor thing. And beginning this year, there's the $35 copay limit on insulin under Medicare Part D. There's also expanded coverage and elimination of copay for adult vaccines under Medicare, Medicaid, and CHIP. And it is also the first year of rebates for Part D drugs, which raised their price at a level which outpaced inflation, or CPIU. So back in March, CMS named the 27 drugs which will have to pay that penalty this year. Some of the big names on that list are Humira from AbbVie and Yescarta from Gilead. So next year, 2024, an election year, perhaps coincidentally, sees some of the big pieces of the IRA go into effect. So first of these would be the elimination of the 5% patient coinsurance for Part D patient catastrophic coverage. There's also expansion of the low-income subsidies, or LIS, for Medicare. This will increase the number of beneficiaries who have prescription drug coverage. There's also the first year of limiting Part D premium growth to no more than 6% a year. And it's also the first year that manufacturers of drugs which are paid for out of Part B will have to pay inflation related rebates, in those sort of penalty rebates. So 2025 sees the remainder of the Medicare Part D redesign implemented. And then 2026 sees the implementation of the negotiated drugs. The first 10 of those drugs prices go into effect. Okay, so let's dive into the Part D redesign in greater detail. So the first thing to note is that this applies to both Medicare Advantage prescription drug plans, or MAPDs, and standalone prescription drug plans, or PDPs. So the column on the left-hand side represents today, 2024, where there are 4 phases of coverage. So first, the patient's deductible, then initial coverage, then the coverage gap, and finally catastrophic coverage. The right-hand column shows Part D as it will be in 2025, where there will only be 3 phases with the elimination of the coverage gap. There's also an interim stage, which is next year, where beneficiary cost share is eliminated in Part D catastrophic coverage. So let's kind of talk about what the implications are and what's being shifted here. So first, 2025 sees the elimination of that coverage gap. Catastrophic coverage, which is the phase in which the patient is now paying nothing, begins once patients reach that $2,000 out-of-pocket maximum. So overall cost to patients, particularly those on specialty drugs, is going to substantially decrease. Second, as an overall effect, the manufacturer responsibility has significantly increased. So most notably, the manufacturers are now responsible for 10% of cost of drugs in the initial coverage phase. So that essentially means a 10% discount on almost every Medicare Part D prescription. And manufacturers are also now responsible for 20% of drug costs once the patient enters that catastrophic coverage phase. and that is in contrast to today when they pay nothing. And another thing to note here is there's no upper limit on that. Previously their responsibility ended once the patient moved into catastrophic coverage. That is no longer the case. Finally, the plan's responsibilities have also greatly increased, particularly in the catastrophic period, where they're quadrupling from 15% to 60%. So one thing that is interesting or noteworthy here is that despite the shift of costs away to a certain extent from CMS, this initiative overall is estimated to cost the federal government about $2 billion. So that is because the federal government is providing additional subsidies. They're also helping with stabilization of premiums to ensure that they do not rise too fast. And additionally, the lower patient out-of-pocket costs, the greater number of patients with prescription drug coverage, that is expected to increase the overall number of drugs which are prescribed. So going to the next slide here, how will this play out in terms of formulary management and impact on manufacturers? So for a discussion of those dynamics, I'm going to hand things over to Max.
Thank you, Caitlin. So, as you can see on the left, well, this is a push and a pull, literally in the graphic there, right? On the left, we have items, provisions, parts of the IRA that are going to potentially increase costs for plan sponsors. The natural response there, of course, is to contain costs, right? Look for places where those organizations can tighten up a little bit. The issue, though, with doing that in a more traditional sense is that there are also provisions which prevent kind of the knee-jerk reactions, as you can see on the bottom in the darker yellow there. There are limits contained in the IRA that are that seek to limit the amount that premiums can increase. Protected class utilization management. Obviously, protected classes have not changed, but they represent a significant volume, and yet plan sponsors still cannot have meaningful utilization management restrictions on those on products in those classes. On the right-hand part of the slide, we have some potential payer strategies that might be employed. But I'd like to invite Dr. Xu to comment here. I mean, what has been the discussion regarding taking these provisions in stride and essentially saying, where are we going to find some extra dollars to manage this?
Thanks, Dr. Fargas. I wish there was a simple solution. Just like the slide says, payers are reacting. I wish the slide says that payers are responding or planning ahead. None of us know. And when I graduated from med school, no one gave me a crystal ball of prediction. But we do need to at least respond or think about how to deal with, basically beyond the financial pressure is the higher utilization. And with that higher utilization, which should be appropriate, will have increased cost. And so as a payer, as a medical director, and hopefully a lot of you are also online as payers or considering what's going on to the health plan, there has to be different ways of thinking. For example, if there's higher utilization, we maybe need to change the benefit, but we're limited. We can't do that. But at minimum, we can look at our formularies and maybe have a more restrictive, or they call skinny formularies. Maybe all of those agents, the formulary should be on the blockbuster drugs out there that are weight loss. So when you make it more skinny formulary, that's not an advertisement for weight loss drug, but just a thought process. The other is what we're doing now is increase our utilization, whether it's increasing the PA itself, the requirements, etc. Those are things. But I think most of the other things that we're thinking about is try to work with the beneficiaries and members to use the drugs, particularly specialty drugs that are less expensive, and or biosimilars and generics. There's going to be a lot of that. And if possible, when the manufacturers have to save, are losing profit off the Medicare recipients, and maybe they're more aggressively contracting on the commercial side, health plans like ourselves also have a response, and maybe we need to be aggressive or assertive, get into better contracts despite some of the changes going on. So this is a little bit what's going on in our thought process. A lot is going on. Things are changing, evolving, but these are some potential ways that we can mitigate, hopefully, some of the cost increases that are being shifted to the health plans.
That's excellent. Thank you. And I wanted to ask you about, Part D in some regions is incredibly competitive for patients. I mean, they have lots of choice. Do you see any effects of what a plan sponsor may do, or what a health plan may do that could either depress or promote their particular plan for Medicare beneficiaries?
Wow, that's a whole business strategy. In the area of competition, do you want to be the health plan that offers the lowest rate and maybe have more members going your way? Or do you want to be somewhere in the middle where you're competitive, but you manage your benefit, the formula better? So I think in the strategy, and remember, one of the things about the Inflation Reduction Act, it also limits your premiums. So it's not like you can make up the difference and charge more, because you can't do that. And as Noel noted, there's competition. But if you are a Part D plan and offer a very competitive area and are able to manage and mitigate some of the financial things, like some of the tools I use, I think that's the ideal strategy to be competitive in this area and survive financially.
Right. Okay. So what I'm hearing there is the winners out of this increased pressure will be the ones who can appropriately balance that patient recruitment and patient enrollment number with cost-effective formulary management.
Exactly. Very, very well put. Thank you.
Back to you, Caitlin.
So Max, I wonder if you wanted to comment a little bit on that aspect of potentially a shift to lower list price products. I know this is something that came up in a recent conversation, and it seems like it may have an important shift in formulary management. So I guess I would ask both you and Dr. Shu your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think overall, taken together, many of the provisions and changes that you just went through in the last three slides really kind of move us to a world where the high WAC, high rebate approach is starting to be chipped away, right? It's starting to feel less and less like an appropriate strategy with the cost sharing changes that you went through. And of course the negotiation, which we'll talk about in a minute. But yeah, I think just, I feel like it's moving us into a world where that approach is, the days are numbered, at least for selected classes, where it kind of makes sense, because each class is a little different with different competition, clinical differentiation, et cetera. Dr. Shu, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think overall the concept of using a drug of lesser cost is smart, but I focus on using the most cost-effective drug in that class. For example, in the NOAC and some of the agents out there, despite maybe some negotiations from CMS referable to that cost, and get a big, discount things on like Eliquis, etc. There are other drugs in that class, the NOACs out there. And there's the ocean, and with better negotiation, maybe they are less expensive. And therefore, health plans will say, you know what, given a choice, and some of these drugs are protected, but we're going to allow you to have easier access, either be a step edit or preferred strategy or better or different PA system to use those drugs, particularly in the area of specialty drugs. I mean, you think of the number one spend in health plans overall, it's in the specialty drug area. So if in an area where there's good competition, better cost for one, and the efficacy is the same, why would a health plan not somehow strategize to use that drug first, if possible? That's a strategy. And similarly, obviously, with the whole push to biosimilars, having a biosimilar before using an originator drug makes total not economic sense, but most importantly, cost-effective sense, and frankly, should be the right thing to do.
Right, and as we discussed, there's that change at the physician level in terms of their reimbursement, which should help ease some of those concerns, which we know are out there. When a bit of a push and a pull when a plan wants to prefer a biosimilar, physician administered biosimilar, the administering physician may not want to do that, but that's been corrected at least for 5 years, which is good.
So similar to that dynamic of trying to eliminate a incentive that might not benefit patients, I know that Adam Fine from Drug Channels has posited that today PBMs and maybe health plans have an incentive to use higher list price products to advance patients towards catastrophic coverage, because the responsibility of the plan is lower in that catastrophic phase, with CMS responsible for 80%. Whereas in the future, that will no longer be the case. So I'm wondering what you two think on that. Do you think that will bear out?
I think for the classes, let's say the classes where it matters, right? The classes that are high budget impact, that are really meaningful to any healthcare organization in the distribution chain. I think we may see that. We may see that. When as in the graphic you showed, the responsibility and the liability, think about it as a liability. Those liabilities are really moving around. And not only that, we're going to have more of the drug utilization kind of exposed to newer actors in the chain here at a much higher volume, because those thresholds are coming down, as you talked about, the 2000, et cetera. So it's certainly possible.
Yeah, I agree with that. Right now, with the way that the catastrophic cap it wasn't there is a push. Doing the math, okay, use the more expensive ones, hit that range. Going forward with the change, that dynamic or the arithmetic or math, however you call it, will no longer work. And I think it behooves health plans even more to understand that, and therefore use the tools of making sure the patient gets the most cost effective, either by step or PA. But also going forward contractually, let's say if you're a health plan, you're concerned on the other side of the fence, for example, commercial side, what are you going to do? Are you going to be still engaging those contracts with the manufacturers? No, I think that will also change too. That concept of a manufacturer coming to you saying, let's give you a good deal. We'll charge you an arm and a leg, but since we're nice guys, we're going to give you a big discount. And you feel good because you got this huge discount for a drug. Versus, I think, going forward with the dynamics of the catastrophic going away and not a push of using those, I think there will be a moderation of the price offer and not as high discounts, because we're at a phase of reasonable offer of cost, reasonable rebates of contract. And at the end of the day, hopefully with all that contracting, we'll have drugs that are cost effective And then as a health plan, we would turn around beyond what we're doing with Medicare Part D on the commercial side, also promoting the use of those drugs that are very cost effective and not pushing the high cost, high rebates where we feel good, but reality, we pay more. So I think that will strategize of moving away from the high whack, high rebate concept in the contracting.
Okay, so now let's move on to the portion of the IRA that has gotten the most popular attention, and that is the price negotiations. This is also the component of the IRA which is being challenged legally it's probably the biggest legal challenge. So as a refresher, the IRA lays out plans for 100 drugs to have negotiated prices in effect by 2031. This begins with 10 Part D drugs that were announced this August, with the intention for those negotiated prices to be implemented in 2026. So there are So CMS, looks at the top 50 drugs by drug spend, and then selects from there. There are some exceptions. Single source name brand drugs or biologics that have biosimilar or generic competition. Small molecule drugs with FDA approval 7 or fewer years ago. That same rule applies to biologics, but 11 years there. Also small biotech companies, orphan drugs with one indication, and plasma-derived drugs. On August 29th, CMS announced these first 10 drugs. That you see here on the screen. So what kind of can we think about that? Well, along with the drugs, CMS provided sort of a Q&A document almost, where it laid out some of the logic and next steps. And based on what they have said, they appear to have taken sort of a pretty mechanical approach to identifying the top 10 drugs. According to that document, they have taken the top 10 drugs by drug spend. They did note that small biotech exception excluded 4 drugs, although there's not a ton of details on that or what sort of the logic was. So prior to these 10 drugs being named, there was a lot of prediction as to what this list would consist of. So I would say that the list, when it was announced, was not a huge surprise, but there were a few things that were sort of a bit of a surprise. Some of the predictions were off probably because they were based on data that was a bit outdated. CMS used data for 1 year ending on May 31st of this year. Another thing that surprised some people in the industry were that Januvia, Stelara, and the Novo Nordisk insulins were selected despite the rather strong potential that by 2026 there will be generic or biosimilar competition. Another thing that CMS guidance document noted was that no drugs were excluded based on biosimilar or generic competition. So that's sort of interesting. Another thing that was a bit of a surprise was the decision to aggregate the 2 Novo Nordisk insulin products together. That was not widely anticipated. So for some further thoughts, I'd like to turn things over to Max to hear your thoughts on these selections and what does it mean, in terms of operationalizing this?
Sure. So basically, we've got our 10 drugs. There was a lot of lead up to getting to this list, but essentially, plans are compelled to cover them, and not only that, they must cover all dosages and formulations, and not only that, they must be covered generally at parity or preferred status to other drugs in the same class. So, and I know there's still some uncertainty out there about what that actually means. And I was glad that CMS clarified that mostly. But basically, the plan, sponsors will have to provide a justification if one of these drugs is now somehow disadvantaged, either from a cost-sharing perspective or a utilization management perspective compared to other drugs in the same class. And then the same thing is true, that a justification is required if the utilization management cannot be tied back to medical appropriateness. Something which I know Dr. Shu really, really stresses and has in his commentary thus far. So, from my perspective, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, okay, in effect, these drugs are essentially now forced to be covered, but assuming they go through the negotiation process and exit that successfully. So maybe their volume goes up. Maybe there was maybe with the negotiated price and the cost sharing changes that you talked about earlier, maybe their volume goes up. But obviously at a lower net price because they've been negotiated in that last column there, which makes me think of how Medicaid works. All right, there's a bit of a give and a take there. There's a mandated discount. You're generally assured coverage. Yes, there can be lots of caveats to that, but that's kind of the concept. That's the spirit. So yeah, there's a lot more to talk about here, but I'll hold some comments. I want to ask Dr. Shu if there's any thoughts you have here as well.
Yeah, as part of this, when we look at these top drugs, I think all of us do welcome the potential of cost savings, price decrease. And that gets to my adage, it's really surprising it took so long for CMS to finally get their act together and say, we can negotiate. What do you mean? What do you mean by that? Well, think about it. Think if you went to a grocery store and you were a regular person there and you bought bread at a certain price. Okay, you accept it. But let's say you're a senior citizen and you bought bread at a different price. Does that make sense? So that never made sense in the area of the, Medicare prescription. Their costs are different and what recipients pay. And the commercial side is very different. So that logic wasn't there. So I think we all welcome that CMS can negotiate and start as a fact, negotiate on these top 10 drugs. The concern that I have here is, and I like Caitlin's concept, this is somewhat mechanical. It's based on volume. But beyond looking at volume and cost, does it make sense to look at these drugs? I think it does. However, if you think of some of these drugs, and by the time this is implemented, some of these drugs will be already generic or biosimilars, how much cost savings are there? Think of some of the big heavy hitters out there that will be potentially generic out there. Eliquis 2026. We have Stelara. We have, the Novo Nordisk product out there. There are already in the works of similar biosimilars for those drugs. Or at a minimum, for example, the competition with Stelara for the treatment of Crohn's disease will be AbbVie's generic biosimilar adalimumab. That's going to be a blockbuster. So why would you pursue dropping the price of Stelara when Stelara, ustekinumab, will be a biosimilar, but already we have another biosimilar that can be used for this condition? So my concern is, while we think by saving on these top 10 is a good start, which I agree, if you look at the details, the overall cost saving because of the other drugs that can be used, biosimilar generics, will not incur all the savings. And I think in response to that, I think CMS has to get their act together and improve what they're looking at, or renegotiate, or have allow health plans to have better tools to manage the cost of these with all the other tools out there. So hopefully that will happen. I think once again, as we welcome all these look at these drugs and negotiating, the overall impact of cost and savings is not clear, particularly with the biosimilar and generic competition out there.
Great.
Okay, so
Go ahead.
let's move on to what this means in terms of next steps. So I think we can generally say that the process for selecting those initial drugs for negotiation, even if there were some uncertainties and some lack of information, was laid out fairly clearly. Now, once we enter this phase of the price negotiation, this is where things become a lot more opaque. And this is where, this first round of Medicare drug price negotiation is really going to set the stage and provide a lot of clarity for future negotiations. So on the left-hand side, you can see a timeline for the next steps in terms of price negotiation. So CMS actually sort of beat its own deadline by announcing the top 10 drugs a couple days early. By October 1st, manufacturers must sign agreements to negotiate. They do have an option not to participate, but in that case, their product is not going to be covered by Medicare. So this is what some people have called a big stick. They certainly do have a big stick. Then by October 2nd, manufacturers have to submit data packages, which include the information that you can see on the right-hand side of the slide. So this includes information on costs. It includes information on any patents or upcoming applications. It also includes information on sales data, and also information on the value of the product. So the level of therapeutic improvement relative to competitors, its price in comparison to competitors, the comparative effectiveness, including for specific populations, which is somewhat interesting. They specifically call out individuals with disabilities, the Medicare population. So I think this is meant to be an inducement for clinical trials to specifically include these potentially historically excluded populations. And then finally, unmet needs, which are addressed by the drug and also by alternatives. So once that is in, and if anyone here on the line is in charge of putting that together, I don't envy you. CMS sends out its initial MFP, which stands for maximum fair price, in February. Then, by March, manufacturers have to indicate whether they'll accept it or not. There's presumably back and forth negotiation until the beginning of August, which is when the negotiation period ends. And then September 1st, those MFP prices are published. There's explanation for the rationale around that will come out, I guess that's 6 months after that, which is somewhat interesting. And then in 2026, those prices will go into effect for the first time. So, what does this mean in terms of, kind of takeaways? I think what stands out to me is that these are extremely short deadlines. The manufacturers must enter agreements by October 1st and then submit really voluminous information by October 2nd. They have to agree to accept the initial offer price or begin the price setting process in March of 2024. That only gives gives them 1 month to review the initial offer. So I think the implications for manufacturers of products which may be on those future lists is that you really need to prepare today. Waiting to see if you're on a list is not a viable strategy. And then on the previous slide, we showed the ceiling prices for the MFPs, and that consists of sort of the minimum discount. So in order to successfully argue that you should be the negotiated price should be that minimum discount level, the manufacturers are going to have to show evidence-driven positions on product effectiveness and also sort of cost effectiveness, although not in a way that is still a little bit unclear. CMS is going to be providing information on the rationale in 2025, so that part is a bit opaque. So let's move on to these thoughts on how this will be operationalized, and I'm going to turn this over to Max and Dr. Shu, with the thinking that let's move to Q&A, in the next 5 minutes or so.
Very good. So there's some I think some unknowns and maybe some knock-on effects which Dr. Shu has introduced, but I think are important to kind of talk about in detail here. I mean, these products, once they exit the negotiation process, they must be preferred. So what is then the effect on existing formulary management, not only in Medicare, but then on the commercial side of the house as well? By simply making some of these products, at least in the first list, are in very competitive categories. By simply making one of them preferred just as a sweep, plans may be in violation of existing contracts, and that needs to be addressed. Another impact I was thinking about was, does this, or an idea that's come up in recent discussion here is, does this start to look like Medicaid with some supplemental rebates, right? So you have the part going to the government, and then you've got parts, maybe a smaller part maybe going to plans for kind of more preferential access, or at least to maintain. I think, though, there's an opportunity for the drugs in these classes that don't get selected. So the competitors in the same class, the competitors to the drugs that were just on the list that we saw, nothing's to stop them from rebating more aggressively to gain parity status. So lots of potential knock-on effects. Dr. Shu, thoughts on that?
I think a lot will be going on. Clearly on the slide you see the impact what's going on, and how health plans are going to use maybe the list of drugs that are negotiated and put on preferred list, or incentivizing prescribers and members to use that list. The other is the aspect of cross benefit management, which we not talk about, and I think a lot of health plans are revving up for that too. Is given all the rules of CMS and all the changes, it makes sense clinically and cost effectiveness to manage the benefits across the table. In other words, have the medical benefits versus formulary benefits, cross manage that the other way around. I think that makes sense. But the main thing I'm going to focus on is what's going on as a response of a managed care organization that has the commercial side. But first and foremost, I think everyone should understand is our discussion is related to the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA. This is not a discussion about Individual Retirement Act. So if you're here in this seminar for that, you're the wrong place. But having said that, if you are working for a commercial plan or a medical director or whatever, and you're not actively thinking about how to manage because of the IRA, you better start putting money away in your true individual retirement act, because you're going to lose your shirts. And so either you're going to retire or not have a job. So think about it. So the spillover effect is the following: that health plans that have not only the CMS products but commercial are going to say, ooh, what's going on? Because clearly, if I was a manufacturer and I had negotiated the price and give sweet discounts or whatever through that long process and give and preferred status because of that, and I'm losing money or less profit on that drug, then as a manufacturer negotiate on the commercial side, their strategy may not be as good, may not be as generous as right now. In other words, they're going to offer less discounts, less rebates, etc. So health plans, think about it. The spillover effect is we need to think about it, how to manage that. And that will include some of the things I talk about of being in response to the manufacturers, also assertively or aggressively contracting with them. And also manage our benefit of preferring certain drugs that are cost effective, having more step edits, having more prior auths, etc. We hate doing that, but to make sure that you're solid in offering a plan and fiscally sound and making sure the right drug is there for that patient, you need to think of that strategy. If not, if you're falling asleep at the wheel or even at the seminar, that is doom and gloom. That is not very good. Now, having said all that, hopefully, as health plans think about this, they see the big picture. For example, if you have, once again, the CMS product and the commercial, what is that balance in managing that? And maybe not as aggressive if your market share is not as dominant on the Medicare side. But if it is, clearly you have to manage it. Clearly you have to sharpen the tools that you currently have, and as I said before, responsively respond with other tools of managing the cost in this area, of preferring those drugs that are most cost effective.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. If you consider that there's there are 100% of rebate dollars today, if the government comes in and says, I'm taking some of those, right? Manufacturers can say, like you said, Dr. Shu, well, if I go over here to my commercial side, maybe I just have less rebate dollars available. And this has come up in some recent discussions with PBMs we've been having, where the potential is that those rebate guarantees on the commercial side may have to start to come down. Thus, as we said at the very beginning, putting another nail in the coffin of the high WAC, high rebate approach. So it really puts a lot of importance on getting that launch price right, such that your product can kind of move through these changes in a measured way, with thought and with reasoning, rather than feel like you're just responding.
Yeah, I agree with that, Max. And you brought up a good point. Working on the commercial side, you talk about PBMs. PBMs seeing the rebate dollars going down, but want to also justify their existence and working with the commercial carriers. They also have to rev up their engines and support the commercial side in response to the Medicare side of saying, how do we negotiate the best price? What are some tools? What are some outcome contracts? What are some of the innovative things that people are talking about that we can use to manage the cost of care on the commercial side? So there is a role for PBMs.
We just have this slide up here, but I do want to get to some questions. So I'll just spend 10 seconds on this. I mean, just some things that we're advising our clients right now. I mean, Caitlin talked about, the negotiation process. As part of that, there's going to be, manufacturers have to submit lots of data. Essentially, when you think about it, they are selling the value to CMS and, in the context of this negotiation. And so essentially what that means to us is product development, new product planning folks, if we have any of them on the line, I mean, these things have to be straightened out at the very, very beginning. What is the clinical differentiation to really protect that product in the future from some of these things? So if it does get negotiated, you've got a great story to walk in there and say, we're better, here's why. And it really starts from the beginning. I talked about the launch price. Another thing to think about is indication sequencing. Maybe indicate. Oftentimes in the early development, you have choices. You have lots of choices of indications based upon the mechanism of action, and maybe this moves folks towards manufacturers towards moving through development those indications with a lower Medicare exposure, and then finally. Just assess the overall clinical development program of the whole company. Kind of balancing. If you're a company that's kind of made your name on treating lots of diseases that have a very high Medicare exposure, this is a big change. Maybe it needs to be diversified a little bit. So these are just some of the things that we're talking about with our clients now and in the past 6 months or so. Well, more than that, but.
Okay. Well, thank you all for a very dynamic discussion. We're looking at some questions in the chat right now, so please put them in and we'll try and get to everyone. Just to get us started, I see one here. I'm wondering from all of you what you think there'll be any unintended consequences of the IRA. I mean, listening to all of you, it's very reminiscent of what we deal with some of our global pricing projects, right? Like how will prices be negotiated by NICE in the UK, for example? Do you think we're heading in that direction? And is that where we're going as maybe an unintended consequence of the IRA?
So I'll just start that off. I think we're moving towards as Dr. Shu mentioned, CMS is finally using its purchasing power in a pretty effective way. But as you know, I mean, in global market access, there are lots of issues with the way other health systems work. I mean, no one has it just perfectly down, right? And no one has it perfect where there are never any challenges. Everybody has access. Everybody feels it's fair. There's always going to be that friction. But I think it is good that CMS is using its power to shake things up a little bit. But yeah, I think we're moving towards an environment where manufacturers have to really support not only the clinical but also the economic value of their product. And as Caitlin said, it's a little opaque how that back and forth is going to go, and we will learn a lot in this first round of 10 products.
Yeah, let me echo. I think one intended consequence is maybe excluding products, and maybe inappropriately, because the reaction to all the negotiation is, okay, you got all the negotiation, and we'll allow the less expensive products out there, but to manage overall costs, as I mentioned. As a health plan, we may start excluding certain products or preclude access. And that actually happened in the UK under NICE. And I actually like NICE. They're a nice group of people, pun intended. And they have good research. But I remember many years ago, I think 15 years ago, when bevacizumab or Avastin was approved in the United States, initially for renal cell cancer, NICE looked at it and says, no, the qualities are not there. We're not covering it. But we were covering it in the United States. Of course, that has changed now. Standard care has changed and no longer people use that. But my point was, NICE used that information of qualities, not cost effective, and excluded it. We included that. If we go forward with the CMS project, which obviously we are all part of, and looking at price itself and hopefully looking at outcomes, that one intended consequence is excluding drugs. And that may be appropriate, but if access an issue, or just like in CMS consideration of comparative effectiveness, we don't consider what populations at risk may need that drug, that is a disaster. It is not appropriate to exclude drugs when unmet needs are there. And therefore, one has to be very careful, and we hope that CMS does its job when they look for the price negotiations through the years, 2 or 3 years, do that. As you saw in the slide that Caitlin was discussing, there's research and looking at the comparative effectiveness. What else is out there? So my hope in all of that is we don't have that unintended consequence of excluding drugs, and that's inappropriate. So access to care is an issue.
Yeah. And as a follow-on to that, what can manufacturers do, I guess, to prove as it leads up to probably being on the Medicare list? I heard you say comparative effectiveness. Is the submission of real-world data going to become more and more important in this light and in this context?
The way I respond to you is the manufacturer has to provide reasonable and good evidence as found in published peer-reviewed literature showing not only how good their drug is, but others, or have a third party. Real-world data, as you know, is fraught with some with danger because it could be at least 5 different kinds. It may be case reports, it may be retrospective claims, it may be registry, and there's or case report on and on. So unless it's a validated so-called RWE, published and peer-reviewed, it's not very helpful. But ideally, the manufacturer has either done the comparative studies or maybe have a third party look at the different studies, comparing drug A with drug B and saying, based on this meta-analysis, based on our considerations, and publish and peer review that, that's the kind of data that we need to look at, the CER so-called, to really look at the true benefits, drawbacks, and advantages of that drug over others.
I think another thing that kind of struck me as I looked through the guidance, because some of the process is rather opaque, but the idea of demonstrating value in those specific populations, sort of the Medicare populations, is something that is mentioned explicitly. So to the extent that manufacturers can begin planning for that, I think that would be a wise move.
I think we have time for one more question. Do you think that payers utilize restrictions on the site of care as a management strategy? I heard you say, making some more, let's say, prior authorizations or making it more challenging to get access. But what about other restrictions on the site of care?
Good, bad, or indifferent, there are benefits of strategy of site of care. Certain site of care, and I'll pick on the hospital outpatient area, are more expensive, let's say, than independent infusion centers. And certainly, those independent infusion centers are more cost effective than physician offices. And while there's movement away from physician offices producing the site of care like infusion, even in oncology, it makes sense to do so because the site of care adds cost overall. Particularly some of the site of care are allowed to do buy and billing. So beyond the buy and billing, beyond the site of care, the buy and billing model versus using specialty pharmacy, that at least in our health plan, where independents are willing to go and get it from the specialty pharmacy and not do buy and billing, you add all of that up, it makes sense to manage the site of care. But the main caveat I mentioned is appropriate site of care. Health plans should not think, and hopefully they don't, oh, we're going to save money by going to one site. The first thing is it appropriate? Is it safe and secure? Like beyond site of care that I mentioned, there's also home health, and people are proposing that as a site of care of cost savings. But the most important thing, is it the right place? Is it the safe place? And then you start thinking about shifting site of care to one specific area that's the most cost effective. And I think there are savings out there, but the most important thing is the appropriate thing to do for that patient's certain circumstance, and court obviously what therapy they're obtaining.
Any other comments from Caitlin or Max?
Oh, I think this is great. I mean, like I said, we're going to learn a lot in this first round, and hopefully clarify some of the unknowns and sort of nuances that we raised today. And yeah, it'll be an interesting next 6 months or so.
Great. Well, thank you very much to Dr. Shu for all of your comments, and to my colleagues, Max and Caitlin, and thank you all for joining. If we didn't get to your question, we're happy to email you. And as well, the slides and a recording can be available through LinkedIn or by contacting us through the Certara website. Thank you again for joining. Talk soon.